Hi guys, welcome back to our lecture on cultural values and beyond. Today we're going to be getting a bit more in depth about these issues. Now, what are values? Again, we talked about them briefly before. So values are broad ideas about what is good, desirable, and correct in society. Things that we think of as part of ourselves, part of who we are. So in America, for example, individuality, being successful, progress, rationality to a certain extent are part of our value system. These beliefs are shared by the majority of the members in society, but may be interpreted differently. Values are very abstract, so people may use the same belief to justify opposite actions. So, for example, in the American Civil War, the use of the word freedom was used on both sides. For people in the North, freedom meant freeing the slaves. In the South, freedom meant the freedom to own slaves. So they had very opposite meanings for the people in different regions. Symbols. Symbols encompass everything that we use as part of our communication system. So they include objects, sometimes like flags, or things that are important to us. If you go to a cemetery, we put up plaques to commemorate people. These are symbols. Language is a very important symbolic system. The words we use, the meanings we have, gestures such as the shaking of the hand. This is a symbol signifying equality, signifying friendship. And if you ever try to shake somebody's hand and they ignore you, you may feel, what is wrong with this person? Clothing may also be considered symbolic because the clothes we wear often are part of a uniform. The shirt, for men, trousers, for women, a skirt. Now, obviously, this has changed to a certain extent. Women also wear trousers. But in other cultures, it may be the reverse. Men may wear something that looks to us very much like a dress. And women may wear trousers. So symbols are a shared understanding of the meaning of the sound, if it's language, the word, or the object, such as a flag. What does this symbol remind you of? Now, many people would say this looks like a swastika. In fact, it is a swastika. Now, a swastika to us, or to many people, symbolizes a certain belief system that we associate with Nazi Germany, a belief system associated with racism, with white nationalism, and many people still use this symbol today in that meaning, in that context. However, this particular symbol is on the floor of a cathedral built in the 6th century in France. Obviously, it does not reflect anything about Nazi Germany. So what is it? Well, it turns out this symbol, which we today call the swastika, is an ancient symbol meaning peace. And this symbol comes from Germanic tribes that originated in the Caucasus. It's also used in India, in Persia, in Kurdistan, and many other areas of the world where people also came from those same regions use this symbol as a symbol of peace. So if you were in Persia, today Iran, you might wear this symbol on your clothes or as a piece of jewelry, symbolizing peace. It has nothing to do in that context with white nationalism or racism. So symbols can change, they can be taken. Hitler deliberately took the swastika as an ancient symbol that he associated with the Aryan people, the Germanic peoples coming from the Caucasus. and he used it as an affirmation of national pride and, frankly, racist pride. And this is why it became associated with negative connotations, because, of course, he then launched a war that killed 70 million people, and he sent 11 million people to their deaths in concentration camps for no other reason than because they did not fit his stereotype of what a German should be. Symbols also affected by changes in social structure. This is another example, the calendar. Have you ever wondered why we have 7 days in the week? Well, this is because in ancient times, people looked at the stars and they noticed that 7 of the stars, or heavenly bodies as it were, did not follow the same pattern as the other stars. And these 7 were the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. In other words, they were the 7 visible planets from the standpoint of Earth. They thought all of these went around the Earth on a different plane from the rest of the stars. And they believed that these then were gods, that they were the manifestation of particularly powerful gods. So, of course, the sun and the moon, they named days after them, Sunday and Monday. In ancient Rome, Sunday was called Solis, Monday was called Lunae. Then, what about the other days? Tuesday in ancient Rome was called Martis, in other words, Mars. In English, we call it Tuesday after the Twi, god of war, who was a Norse god. So we have the same god, but the Norse name. Wednesday in Rome was the day of Mercury. In English, we use Wednesday is Woden, who is the god of the messengers, the same god again as Mercury. Thursday, Thor, was the god of thunder. In Roman, it was Jovis, and that's why, for example, in countries that use Latin language, so for example, Spanish, Tuesday is Martes, Wednesday is Miércoles, Thursday is Jueves, Friday is Viernes. So you see that there is a direct connection between the names of the weeks and the ancient Roman, and in the case of English, Norse gods. So why do we use, in a Christian society, these same gods? Well, the hypothesis is that when Christianity expanded into the Roman Empire, they didn't want to risk too much disruption of local belief systems. So they adopted the local symbols that, in fact, incorporated the pagan gods. Language, as we can see, for example, ancient Egyptian used originally symbols or pictures of the objects they wanted to represent. Later, these became simplified into what we now call letters. So Phoenician, the eagle became A. In Greek, A, and Roman, of course, is the letters we use today come from Rome primarily. So these are based on the previous Greek, Phoenician, and Egyptian alphabets. So again, these are symbols that stand now for sounds, and these sounds then are put together to create symbols. Some people believe that these symbols are very powerful. Linguistic relativity hypothesis, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, essentially argues that our language, the way we use words, can affect our understanding of the world around us. So, for example, in many ancient societies, of course, darkness was seen as a negative thing. In daylight, you can see, you can watch where you're going, the sun gives you energy and warmth. The opposite of that was nighttime, was darkness, when the animals roamed around, when it was scary to go outside because you couldn't see anything. And it was colder. So the argument is, when people first saw people from Africa, they created a negative connotation, or it was easier at least to create a negative connotation. So blackness or darkness became a negative term applied to people with that skin color. You also keep in mind how writing, when you write things down, it creates and allows cultural transmission over time. But it's always interesting when you read something that was written a long time ago, even just 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or think of Shakespeare, who wrote 400 years ago. It's sometimes very hard to understand because the ways or the meanings of words sometimes have changed over time. So it's difficult for us to read them and say, what did this mean? It doesn't mean anything in modern English, or it's very confusing. But that's because the meanings of the words have changed. Cultural universals refer to things that every culture tends to have, but always keep in mind that in every society they interpret these things differently. Typically, cultural universals exist because every society has to deal with similar problems. They all have to provide food, they have to provide shelter, companionship, reproduction, self-defense, and so on. But they all do it in different ways. So the meaning of the word food, for example, in many cultures, the word bread means food because bread was the basic type of food. In English, when I grew up in England, we used corn. We said corn to refer to any kind of grain cereal. It was kind of a generic term. But in fact, of course, corn is a very specific type of cereal. Marriage is another example. We have marriage. Every society has some way of celebrating the union of two people together. But it doesn't always mean the same thing. It doesn't always mean one man and one woman. Sometimes it's one man, several women, or one woman, several men. Or it could even be, in some societies, a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. So what it means to be in a marriage might mean quite different things. And these meanings will change over time. As society changes, the way we think about things change. So the symbolism changes. So for example, love and marriage hasn't always been something that went together. In pre-industrial societies, most people would marry for convenience. They would marry somebody who was convenient to their business or their family. And basically, family and business meant the same thing. If you were a farmer, you wanted a strong woman who would give you strong kids, who would go out there and plow the fields. If you were a warrior, you would want to marry somebody that would align you with another warrior family to create alliances. If you were a prince or a king, you would be forced to marry somebody who would help create an alliance for your family dynasty. Love had very little to do with it. Children were there in order to create labor or provide labor, and when they grew up, to help provide security and to take care of you, hopefully, when you became old. Love had very little to do with marriage. It had to do with duty and responsibility. Now, in modern society, these things don't mean the same things. We don't work inside the family. The family is no longer a productive unit. It's a consumption unit. It's where we consume things together. And yes, families still have a role, but it's a very different type of role. It's supposed to be at least a supportive role. So now we think of marriage as based on love. In other words, affection between the people within the family. Children are supposed to be loved and not simply objects of labor. And in reality, children are expensive. They're an economic burden because they don't provide for the family anymore. Families are expected to be happy together. So the ideal has become quite different. And when children grow up and leave, parents sometimes have to go through a period of readjustment. How do we deal with each other? And sometimes, if they're lucky, their children will have children. They can become grandparents. I say if they're lucky, I don't know. It depends on how they feel. The point is, these things change. So the structure of the family has changed. The reasons we're in the family has changed. What family symbolizes has changed because the social structure has changed. You might ask, which is better? Which is easier? It's up to you to decide. Now, because we grow up within a particular culture, we tend to, of course, believe that is the best possible culture. We may have disagreements with it, but it is very hard not to be ethnocentric. In other words, not to believe that our culture is better than other cultures, our way of doing things are better, our values are better. And typically when we look at other cultures, we will judge them according to our culture. We will say they don't have this, they don't have that, they have these weird beliefs or these weird practices. So we don't fully understand them, or sometimes don't even try to understand them. Now, as a sociologist, we need to practice cultural relativism. This means understanding each culture within the context of their own beliefs and behavior. So it's very easy to criticize another culture. It's a lot harder to try to understand another culture. So one way of thinking of this is having a value-free understanding, not judging another culture based on our own cultural norms. As I said, this is not easy to do because we are our culture. We have grown up within our culture, and those values and norms have been inculcated within us, and to the extent that we think of them as nature, as part of our special being. So, as I said, it's hard to understand other people. This guy is in a pot. What's going on? He says, I know they have to eat, but eating all this fat is not good for their health. So it doesn't mean you have to accept everything. You can still make suggestions or comments, but you have to do it within the context of that other culture. It may be, for example, that certain cultures, like American culture, have very bad eating habits, and it's not good for people. But it doesn't sound good if somebody from England or France says it. But if people provide medical evidence or other types of evidence, we might be persuaded that we need to eat more healthily. Now, cultures are not monolithic blocks. They usually have many different subcultures or different variations of the dominant cultural pattern. So a subculture is a part of a culture. They participate with the main culture, but they may have different values, norms, and lifestyles. The most different will usually be immigrant groups who come to another country and for a while will maintain their own cultural norms. So, for example, every immigrant group coming to America from Europe or Africa or wherever else, for a while, at least a generation or two, maintained their own value and normative systems to at least a certain extent. So they may adjust in some ways to the dominant culture, but in other ways they would maintain their own values and norms. Other subcultures may arise within the dominant culture, such as youth subculture. Young people might create a subculture so they can be distinct from their parents. So they may come up with new words or new ways of expressing things, maybe so their parents don't know what they're talking about. So a code of some sort. Institutions may have different subcultures. Professions, so for example, doctors will have ways of thinking about things and value systems that may be a little different from other people. One college may have a different way of doing things than another college. There are also groups like the Amish, if you've heard of them. Sometimes they're called the Pennsylvania Dutch. They're a religious group that originated in Switzerland as a very strict Calvinist cult, and they believe that they should not participate in any modern technology, that they should live a simple life that people live basically in the Bible. So they don't use motors, they don't use cars, they don't use electricity, or at least not for themselves. They might use it for guests, but not for themselves. And that is because they believe that this is keeping themselves pure. At the same time, the Amish speak a variant of German, and they tend to keep away from other people. They call other people English because we speak English, so they call us the English. They don't hate us, they don't despise us, they just believe that they have their way of doing things. And most Amish are quite happy, and in a certain way they're a successful group. Are they a subculture or a counterculture? Well, we'll talk about countercultures in a second. A counterculture is a group whose values, norms, and lifestyle directly reject the standards of mainstream culture. Sometimes they're part of a social movement that says we find dominant value system wrong. So gangs may be part of a counterculture. Punks, groups that used to put pins in their skin so that they would dramatize their disdain for mainstream culture. Some religious cults could be considered a counterculture. Maybe, well, the hippie movement originally was a counterculture. They tune in, light up, and drop out. So they believed that American society was hypocritical, it was warlike, and they just wanted to live in peace on their commune. Now, when you go from one culture to another, or sometimes even into a subculture or a counterculture, you may feel or experience a feeling of loss. You don't understand the system. You don't understand why people are doing what they're doing. Because in your culture, you feel at home. Now you're in another culture, you feel everything's strange. So, for example, I've lived in the Middle East for many, many years. I've become accustomed to the way things are done in the Middle East to a large extent. But it doesn't mean I accept everything. I'm still quite different. But at first, it was a shock to see how people did things that at home we would think of as maybe disgusting or maybe as wrong in one way or another. There's a very good movie about Sudanese immigrants who came to the United States. They were Christians coming from areas of Sudan where there was no food, where literally people were starving, and they come to America and one of them gets a job in a supermarket, and part of his job is to throw out all the food at the end of the day. And he was shocked. How can you throw away all this perfectly good food? And he would see homeless people or hungry people on the street, and he couldn't understand a society where you could throw away food while there were hungry people. He could not understand it. And one day he finally breaks down and he ends up giving some of the food he's supposed to throw away to a homeless person. And when he's caught, he quits. He says, I can't handle this anymore. This doesn't make any sense to me. So that's an example of culture shock. I have a similar, well, not similar, but example of my own. I grew up in England, and at the age of 14, I moved to Orange County, California. And the shock for me was the wide streets, the number of cars, the fact that you couldn't go anywhere without having to cross 20 lanes of traffic just to go to the local store. It was very comfortable. We had a nice swimming pool, but nothing made sense to me. I was used to a community where you could walk to the store, where you could play in the streets, where children could go anywhere on buses and feel safe. So after a few weeks, I went to San Francisco to visit my father, and I don't know if you've ever been to Orange County or San Francisco, but it's like total opposites. In San Francisco, the streets are small. You have neighborhoods where children are playing. You have parks. You have buses everywhere. So I felt like I was a lot closer to home. It made more sense to me. And I ended up staying in San Francisco with my father simply because of that. Simply because it made more sense to me. And Orange County, had great beaches, it had great malls, it had swimming pools, but I just could not get used to those streets and the lack of ability to walk around, particularly as a teenager at the time. So because we don't understand the values, we don't see any sense in the norms. Why don't they have buses? Why don't they have ways of getting around? Why do they have all these big streets? Durkheim uses the term anomie, which means normlessness, a state in which you lack norms. You don't understand the norms. And his argument is we need to have norms. We need to have something that helps to regulate our behavior and that makes sense to us. It doesn't matter what it is. In America, we drive on the right-hand side of the street. In England, people drive on the left-hand side of the street. Which is correct? It doesn't matter. The point is that everybody knows which side of the street they're driving on. Because if they didn't, they would be crashing all the time. And so normative behavior is extremely important. And very often when we become adapted to a culture, when we go back to our original culture, we experience culture shock again, because now we don't understand our own culture, at least parts of it. So for example, in this 5 stages, when you go to a foreign culture, very often there's initially a honeymoon stage because you're just happy to be traveling. And then you notice all these things that people are doing seem really strange. And of course, you think of them as bad. So you become hostile and irritable. Nothing makes sense to you. Over time, you gradually adjust and get used to the way things are. You may not fully accept them, but you get used to them. You adapt, and maybe in some cases you become nativized. So when you come back to your original culture, you have re-entry shock. You don't fully understand it at first. Although, to be honest, this period doesn't last very long. You normally become reacclimatized quite quickly. Thank you again for joining us and watching this last lecture. And don't forget, always check your companion for review. And there's a great article dealing with culture shock, with a very strange culture called the Nasarima. So make sure you read the article, Body Ritual Among the Nasarima. Thanks.